Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cellular Healing TV. I'm Ashley Smith, and today we revisit an episode from 2018 with Dr. Margaret Christensen. Toxic mold is an incredibly common yet often completely unassuming trigger and cause of many different chronic health conditions. Dr. Pompa is meeting with Dr. Christensen, who is an integrative doctor who has conquered mold in her own life, and she's here to share her story and hopefully help you understand how to know if mold is affecting you. They'll discuss why toxic mold is becoming so common these days and how toxic mold is different from regular mold allergies. You'll also learn what mycotoxins are and what common symptoms are if you're struggling with chronic health problems and mold may be to blame. So thanks for joining and welcome again to Cellular Healing TV.
Hey, I want to tell you about one of our sponsors, Cyto Detox. Look, podcasts cost money. There's a lot of production going around this, but we are grateful to have Cyto Detox as one of the sponsors. It's so easy for me to talk about the product because myself and my family use it constantly as we practice what I preach. For over 15 years, I've talked about and taught doctors and the public about cellular detox. And I'll tell you, Cyto was a breakthrough. Cyto was a breakthrough for us. And it's changed so many lives. So we're grateful that they sponsor Cellular Healing TV. It makes sense, doesn't it? They should.
If you're listening to this podcast and want to access the amazing Cyto Detox product Dr. Pompa just mentioned, please visit detoxoffer.com. Again, that's detoxoffer.com.
Well, Margaret, welcome to the show. Cell TV, that is.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, for having me.
Yeah, well, I was on your summit, your mold,
Absolutely.
where you had some of the world's experts in this topic. Wow, what a topic. I'm excited to bring this again to Cell TV. We've done a lot of shows on how to make your home safe, but we haven't done a mold show in a while. And when I look at why people are sick, why people can't lose weight, hormonal problems, unexplainable illnesses or symptoms, autoimmune, mold is one of the things we always have to determine if it's a factor. And I'll tell you, it's one of those hidden factors that most people think they're not being exposed because they don't see mold, but yet it can be one of the causes that goes hidden and unseen. So, well, Margaret, tell me your story. I mean, how did you get involved in this? So much so.
Wow.
A summit on mold, and I think you're the only mold summit that I know of, and I think it's a really important one for everyone to watch. So, how'd you get involved in this?
Well, it's funny because I don't think anybody's attempted to do a mold summit before because it's such a huge and complex topic.
Right.
Because it's involving two patients. You have the person themselves and their family and or their coworkers, and then you have the building, the home, the school, the church, the dorm, whatever it is. So in terms of my own personal story, I was a really successful OBGYN. I had a big practice here in Dallas where I am, and this was 18 years ago, and I was just getting so fatigued. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I was so tired all the time. Yeah, I had 4 kids, and I didn't sleep much delivering babies, but something else was wrong. My whole body hurt. And I couldn't, and I would go see my different colleagues and say, well, honey, you're just depressed. Here's your antidepressant, or, go see the pain doctor, go see the physical therapist, and nothing was really helping. And now at the same time, a number of my family members were also sick. We had asthma, allergies, ADD issues, migraines, a lot of sleep disturbances, some psychiatric stuff going on. And no dots were ever connected. And it took actually over 8 years. And I ended up having to close my practice because I felt so bad. And I still didn't figure out what was wrong with me. It wasn't until a re-exposure 8 years later that I figured out and realized, oh, we had toxic mold in that house. We had sold it and moved out. But took everything with us. I knew nothing. And,
right. Meaning that you can contaminate the next place.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think that the next place we went to also had some issues. And, one of the interesting things is I was actually able to get better initially because of this. I got into functional medicine. I had a friend who gave me some nutrients and, much to my resistance, because I was like, expensive urine. But I started taking them and I felt significantly better better within about 10 months, and then I quit taking them because I thought I don't need them, and I crashed after I stopped taking them. This was about 2 years into this process, and I was like, biochemistry and physiology. And because of that, I got into functional medicine. I started going to some courses, and really, I still didn't know what the problem was. But I got better just from changing diet and lifestyle until I got hit a second time. Now, again, my family members were still, everybody was having issues. And Dan, this is so common. I'm sure you see this all the time. Doctors don't realize what they're seeing. And just like you mentioned, everything from autoimmune to chronic neurological diseases, psychiatric disorders is a really big one that is completely unrecognized as being related. I've got some great cases that we can talk about. But well, anyway, that's how I got into this. And I actually, I closed my practice twice. My big practice, because I couldn't keep going, and I took 2 years off just to get better. And I started this little teeny tiny practice in the back of a compounding pharmacy. And then I moved my way up, got into another office. That office building was really toxic, and the apartment that I was living in part-time was also moldy. So it was like following me around. Jill Carnahan, we kind of laughed about this, and some of the other folks on the summit that I talked to, we're just sort of like mold magnets. It follows us everywhere we go. And, some of us are a lot more susceptible than others to some of the side effects. So it took a while to figure out. It wasn't until that second re-exposure I actually went to the Environmental Health Center, which is here in Dallas. There's a very famous Dr. William Ray, Bill Ray, who's one of the pioneers in environmental medicine.
Just recently died, unfortunately.
He did recently die, and he died the week before I was supposed to interview him for the summit. So I did interview Dr. Stephanie McCarter. She's on, and she's talking about EMFs and the role of the electronic fields in, again, exacerbating all kinds of illness. And that's a whole nother topic we can talk about, and what it does to molds. But so that's how I got started. And then I, started a little teeny boutique practice in functional medicine. And over time, again, my husband developed Parkinson's, and he had Lyme too. And we know that mold is such an immunosuppressant that any underlying infections that you've picked up along the way, viruses, parasites, mold, Lyme, that can all rebirth itself.
Yeah,
and
by the way, mold is such a big factor that many people are trying to get well from these different infections, and they can't because they're in a mold exposure unknowingly, right? And you have to get rid of the mold exposure. By the way, folks, we're going to make sure we link you to the Mold Summit, because you need to see, the world's experts in this area. This is a big deal. I have to ask this question.
Sure.
Why you had been in many different mold exposures.
Right.
I was part of, I had massive mercury in my brain, and, we were living in probably a low grade mold exposure, but it became more problematic because my bucket was full. We realized that most people are bombarded with different neurotoxins, right? And metals and mold are some of the biggest ones. Why is mold so prevalent? I mean, you are in how many mold, and so many people are in homes right now, or businesses or schools, unknowingly, but there's mold. Why has this become such an epidemic?
Well, that's a great question, Dan. And unfortunately, at least 50% of houses and 60% of commercial buildings have had some kind of water damage. And a lot of it has to do with how we build and construct homes and, buildings in this country with the materials that we're using, particularly sheetrock, which is basically paper. It's food. It's food. It's food for cellulose. It's food for molds and shoddy building standards. And it's real interesting because in other places of the world, they don't have quite the same problems that we do. But you also have the challenges with very tight buildings, and particularly, again, buildings that were built in the 70s and 80s that don't breathe. They don't breathe well. So you don't have good air circulation. So once you get a water problem, whether it's from an air conditioner leak or from a toilet overflowing, or it can be window leaking. It doesn't have to be a roof. It doesn't have to be a flood, and there's the problem, Dan. So much of the time, it's these small, slow leaks that are happening behind walls. People don't notice, and or underneath the houses if they're on a pier and beam house. That's another common challenge. And because of how the air conditioning system works, and if you have fans on inside the house that are sucking air in through the walls or in from underneath the house, and that can contaminate the space. And, then it gets into the air conditioning system and you're blowing mycotoxins around. And we can talk about specifically mycotoxins because that's the big problem,
Yeah.
Especially for mitochondria.
Yeah, because I think when people think of mold, they think allergy.
Yeah.
But they're having an allergy to the spore, but mold produces a biotoxin. Explain that for people, because that's a really important distinction.
That's a really great distinction. So, again, most people, when they're thinking about mold, they're thinking about the mold counts that are outside and, it's spring or fall and you have, more pollen and more molds. That's different. And those definitely, that can cause allergies. But the type of molds that grow inside water damaged buildings that are, again, feeding on the sheetrock, those not only can cause, chronic allergies, stuffy nose, recurrent sinus problems, sinusitis, infections, upper respiratory cough, drainage, etc., but it's the mycotoxins that those toxic molds produce that are so damaging to cell membranes and to mitochondria. And I know all of your folks watching know what mitochondria are. That's the powerhouse, the energy production in our cells. Right. So these mycotoxins, they're fat soluble. So once they get in your system, they're going to go to the areas of fat. That's in between the cell membranes is a layer of fat.
Right.
In the mitochondrial membranes, there's a little layer of fat. And what's our brain? It's all fat.
Yep.
And so when you get these mycotoxins that get in you, you can have had exposure like, you grew up in a moldy basement, in, somewhere up in the Northeast coast. And maybe you had some allergies, you didn't feel great, but you weren't really sick. But then subsequent exposures over time, it's this sort of sicker, quicker phenomenon.
Yeah.
You've built up your bucket.
Yeah. Yeah. I would just walk into a restaurant and be, and I had a nose for it at one point, I could smell it a mile away. And then lo and behold, I'd realize I'd be sick days later. Time for weeks just from one exposure. Even walking in, smelling it for, 5 smells before I turned around and got out, I still got sicker quicker, meaning our immune system was so hypersensitized now from this. It just drove this inflammatory response. And people have no clue that that's happening, by the way, right? And that's a sad thing. Talk a little bit about, because I want people to identify, because now we have people thinking, well, maybe this is me. So
right.
Talk about that. Give some symptoms, and we can even talk about some tests that we need to run, and then some tests maybe if you want to test your house. So let's kind of go in that direction for people.
Okay, sure. So let's again, one of the common symptoms is recurrent upper respiratory infections, chronic cough, or chronic allergies and sinus infections. So if you've been on antibiotic after antibiotic after antibiotic for a chronic sinus infection, we know that that's a fungal problem. It's fungal overgrowth that has taken place in the cavities because you've killed off all the good bacteria anyway with the antibiotics. But breathing in the molds and the mycotoxins themselves are incredibly irritating to the whole sinus system, and they create biofilms. So what you get is this sort of slime-like layer of molds together with bacteria, with yeast, with fungi, and they make a layer of snot around themselves that's protecting themselves from our immune system and from antibiotics. And so what happens? People take oral antibiotics after oral antibiotic after oral antibiotic, and maybe they get some sinus surgery and they still are sick. It's fungal. You have to use some type of antifungal treatment and then rinsing out the sinuses. Now,
Yeah, I was just going to say, and there's a test that I like to run called Marcon's, testing for Marcon. It's a simple nasal test for $80 to $100.
Yeah, so we can do that. And Marcon's is looking for the bacterial infections. But what, even...
but now they run a fungal portion of it. But when you have these resistant staph up there, these negative staph, it's an indicator that you were in a mold exposure.
Absolutely. And, and that you've been on tons and tons of antibiotics. So, we don't even have to get those nasal cultures anymore. There's a really, really great organization that I would strongly recommend that all of your participants check out because there's a section for the lay people. It's called the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illness, and ISEAI.org. And what we're doing is bringing together all the minds who've been working on these complex chronic illness problems and mold toxicity and Lyme and infections, everybody kind of coming together along with environmental air inspectors and experts in that area, along with the lay public so we can all work together to try and solve all these problems, kind of like people are working together to try and solve autism, because it's such a common challenge that we're seeing. So we talked about sinus infections. That's a biggie. And again, we need to think about when your sinuses are inflamed, all those cytokines, those chemicals in your sinuses being produced by the white blood cells, they're seeping into your brain. Yeah. And that gives it, so you get that brain fog, that heavy-headedness. I just don't feel good. I can't think straight. I get headaches, get migraines. Those are common symptoms. Brain inflammation, also anxiety, particularly sort of that free-floating anxiety, can't ever figure out where it's coming from, have a hard time sleeping, can't get that brain to calm down and be derevved. Yeah. That's a problem. Again, kind of chronic brain inflammation, we both know, creates a depression. So, and then what happens when you're swallowing all those boogies? They're going into your gut, and then you're disrupting that microbiome, and you've already taken 10 rounds of antibiotics, which has really disrupted your microbiome, suppressed your immune system. You're even more susceptible. Yeah. So that's the kind of chronic challenges that we see. One of our guests is Evan Brand, who is real big on candida and yeast. And so we talk about the yeast mold connection is so common because people are being exposed to toxic molds, getting infections, and then getting treated with antibiotics, and then you get yeast in the gut, vaginal yeast, you get prostatitis, you can get interstitial cystitis, which is kind of recurrent irritation of the bladder. So those are things. We talked about anxiety and depression, even bipolar and psychoses. Mary Ackerley is one of the gals we interview, Dr. Mary Ackerley. She's an amazing psychiatrist, and got into mold toxicity just sort of totally by accident. And now, again, she and a lot of the other docs who are psychiatrists on this ICI.org forum are talking about 80% of their clients that they're measuring have mycotoxins of this with psychiatric challenges. Wow. You can get a lot of mold rage and kind of psychosis type symptoms. And then I talked with Doug Kaufman, he wrote a very famous book called The Fungal Link. He's got an amazing show called KnowTheCause.com that's, people watch all around the world. He and I talk about the connection to addiction and alcoholism also. Because when your brain is on fire, you feel like crap, you can't sleep, you're super anxious, what do you try and do? You're trying to calm it down. And then you're feeding it. So we know, again, when you get that leaky gut, a lot of that fibromyalgia, kind of chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, those are very common symptoms. And then, one area that you've taught so many of your mentors, Jay Davidson, who's on the show, Todd Watts is on the show, Scott Richmond, they're also interviewed talking about chronic infections, parasites, Lyme, co-infections.
Yeah. And, those guys were my students early on, and the message then, and keep spreading the message was, look, you have to look upstream to these heavy metals and molds and mycotoxins, to parasites, to candida, to your point. Right. Yeah. Because the people that can't get rid of these things to get better, they could be living in a mold exposure, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really interesting because one of the folks that I interviewed that's on the bonus section is Dr. Dennis Hooper of Real Time Lab. So he developed one of the first tests to test the urine for mycotoxins. And what he taught me is that one of the mycotoxins that is produced is called mycophenolic acid. And mycophenolic acid is actually used in medicine to kill the immune system before somebody's going to have a bone marrow transplant. So can you understand that if we're breathing stuff in that is producing toxins that disrupt hormones, create neurological disturbance, and suppress the immune system, no wonder if you have underlying viral infections, parasitic infections, again, tick-borne illnesses like Lyme or co-infections, all of those can bloom and rise. So it's kind of chicken and the egg, or you get bitten by a tick and you're doing okay until you move into a moldy house.
Absolutely. Yeah, because the immune system will keep most of those things at bay. We all have candida, and now they're finding out 90% of population Lyme. Why aren't they all sick? Well, until they move into a mold exposure or have a heavy metal exposure, it's always the perfect storm. Is there a test? Okay, you mentioned the urine mycotoxins, what are some other tests that someone could run on them? And then how do we test for homes? How do we know?
Sure. And that's, so we go into there's a lot of different variety of testing, kind of looking at the underlying disturbances in physiology and all that. But I think that one of some of the best tests now are these mycotoxin urine tests. One is from Real Time Lab. You have to have a physician lab. They've been around the longest. They do have an extensive panel that particularly looks at trichothecenes, the black mold guys. GPL Labs now has a urine mycotoxin test that's relatively new. Some of us who are doing this are using both tests depending on what the situation is that's presenting. There's some interesting, the GPL test looks at zearalenone, which is one that is very hormonally disruptive, found in, that actually is tested for a lot in the animal industry. So those are some ways of testing. There's a very inexpensive screening test that can be done online, the visual contrast sensitivity, or VCS
we use that
test.
too. It's a great first screen.
Yeah, it's a great first screen. Now, just because it's negative doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have an issue.
Right.
But so it's again, all of these can have false negatives. In fact, that's one of the things that we tell folks is if you do a urine mycotoxin test and it's negative, even though you've had a known exposure and you've got all the symptoms, it may be because your body is so toxic it's having a hard time detoxing for it to come out in the urine. So there's ways that we provoke it and ways to help. And I've definitely seen this, like, if you're treating somebody all along and you give them some biofilm busting agents, or you're, working with treating their Lyme and using something like Biocide, and when you break up the biofilm in their gut, in their nose, whatever, you'll see an increase in the level of mycotoxins before it comes down. So, we kind of get into that. There's a lot of different blood work that you can use. Dr. Shoemaker is one of the ones who initially kind of elucidated a lot of different tests, some inflammatory markers, things like TGF-beta and MSH. Those can all change. We don't need to do the genetics anymore.
Yeah, I don't look at genetics either. We learned, we did the HLA tests on, I don't know, I was training many doctors as well. And we looked at it, and first of all, we didn't come out with the same statistics. Second of all, what relevance is it? Because we would have 4 people in the house. The sickest one didn't even have the gene half the time. It was other exposures, where their bucket was filled and ended up reacting more to the mold. But, the C4 little a is a good one, but it has to be done by National Jewish Laboratories. LabCorp, test does it.
It's a pain to get it, and then you have to ship it on dry ice. So, it can be useful, but I've quit using that just because it's expensive and it's hard to get. And, I find with a good history, a positive mycotoxin test, and, again, a lot of the symptoms. And then to me, I recommend looking deep again. When you start using binding agents, and we talk about all the different ways that you can approach these challenges. But if somebody is not getting better, then you wonder, A, is there an ongoing exposure? Because you've got to get out of the situation or clean it up, one or the other. And B, again, do they have a confounding challenge like a heavy metal toxin, parasites,
I
candida?
on that for you, that compounding factor, it just really makes people sick. Let's talk about testing the house, because oftentimes you're right. I mean, if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, right? And then you start asking questions about people's homes, right? And we had some water leaks, but it's not hard through a few questions to go, okay, there's a problem,
Right.
So what's some of the better tests they can do? Because typically people get online and they'll find they test for mold, they come out and do an air swab test. Teach our people here.
Right. And, again, on, I think the day 5 of this one, I have the different mold inspectors on, and there's a number of different ways that we need to test. Obvious mold that's easy to see. It's the hidden ones that are the challenges. So it's important you can do air sampling, and there's some do-it-yourself home kits that you can get. The challenge with those is that you have to know what the data is that you're looking at. But whoever's doing air sampling too should get disturbed air samples, not just sticking something in the middle of the room. You need to be sure your HVAC system has been on. You can even kind of walk around and use a fan or a blow dryer to kind of stir up the dust, because some of these molds are very heavy, like the Stachybotrys or Chytomium. Those are some of the really bad guys that they've been there for a long time. They're really heavy. They're very difficult to pick up in air samples.
Yeah.
You can use mold plates, and one of the guys I interviewed is JW Biava from immunolytics.com. They do an amazing job of kind of do-it-yourself home kits that people can test for. Now, you want to put it not just in the middle of a room somewhere and or on your bed where you sleep, but also put it in those dark, moist spaces, underneath a sink, in underneath the refrigerator, in your laundry room. Those are some places that you need to think about. Hot water heaters in there. So those are some other areas you can pick up some of maybe the hidden ones. But really, if you, and then there's some vacuum tests. Again, Dr. Shoemaker popularized those. The Hertzme test, or the ERMI test, where you get a vacuum sample. Now, it's interesting because, all the qualified mold inspectors tend to poo-poo that test because for lots of different reasons. But I still find that if people are wanting to try and get a little assessment of kind of the history of what's been in their house, and if there are some of the bad molds on there in the Aspergillus and Penicillium families and the Stachybotrys family, then that there's a problem that needs to be, then you need to hire a professional. And that's a whole nother ball of wax. And we give you a lot of guidelines about what makes a quality professional. And you sign up for the Toxic Mold Summit, there's a free ebook guide. And I have in that guide, I have some lists of organizations that you can contact, good mold inspecting, kind of around the country, and some resources.
Yeah, where they're available, mold dogs are amazing. We've had major people problems solved with mold dogs. I mean, they sniff out drugs at the airport. Yeah. They can sniff out mold very easy because mold has an odor, right? And some people just don't smell it when you live in your own house. I walk into people's homes, I'm like, mold.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So that's another, that is definitely another way to do it. And I think one of our bonus interviewees is a guy one of the first guys who was using mold dogs. And there's, but I think, a quality inspector who knows what they're looking for, especially if you have multiple family members who are sick with lots of different stuff, and everybody's irritable, nobody's sleeping well, you got ADD, learning disorders, headaches. That's when you got to start thinking, is it something environmental?
You have to go there. You have to roll it out. It's my R number one. Remove the source. Otherwise, you'll never upregulate normal detox pathways, and you'll never downregulate the cellular inflammation. So, mold is a biggie. Okay, right now, I think it's a hidden, my next seminar in March we have a focus on cancer. Tell us a little bit about, because there's more showing a link between hidden mold and cancer.
Absolutely. And again, these are some of the things that I talked to with Doug Kaufman. It's some of the stuff that I talked to with Ty Bollinger and his wife are on the summit, and we talk about the cancer link. Doug Kaufman as well, and Dennis Hooper. Aflatoxins in particular are known, again, they're immunosuppressants. So especially if you're looking at leukemias, lymphomas, those are definitely hormonally associated, mold toxin associated cancers, kidney, bladder, those are some other ones. So for several different reasons, both you're suppressing immune system as well as impacting the mitochondria. Those are things that create the cancer cells, and then you get that fungal and yeast overgrowth, and you're feeding it all sugar, and that's where some cancers arise. I've had gals again with breast cancer who was living in a moldy house, and so she was getting chemo and all that, and of course that was giving her fungal overgrowth and yeast overgrowth and antibiotics, and she really couldn't get better until she got out of that house, and we started really working on the fungal side of the issues.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things that you have to consider. If you have any immune challenge, any autoimmune, any unexplainable illness, you better look under this rock, literally.
Yeah. And then there's the neurological diseases that are so common too. Everything from Parkinson's and Alzheimer's. Dr. Dale Bredesen talks about inhalation Alzheimer's. The fact, and we're breathing this stuff into our noses, is getting in our sinus right here by our brains. The olfactory nerve goes right back into the brain under the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So it is a conduit for chronic inflammation into the brain. And so no wonder you can get everything from psychiatric symptoms to neurodegenerative diseses.
Well, I mean, you said it. It goes right in for that pituitary hypothalamus, which controls the thyroid, the adrenals. So many people are down in functional medicine doctor trying to treat that. And this is, I put this warning out all the time. It's like, I like to say, look, there's three big ones you have to consider: mold, metals, and hidden infections in the mouth. Absolutely. And by the way, which is another topic, because a lot of times we find these cavitations that make people very sick. Now we have better testing to test what's in them. Guess what we're finding? The mold that's in people's exposures end up making their way into these cavitations. So now we have another problem. So check for cavitation, right? And check for mold.
So, folks can get really overwhelmed with all this because it is a big ball of wax, and, then you're talking about your house, and there's a lot of challenges. And part of, again, kind of watching the summit is you can hear all these different stories, but there's so much resilience and there's hope. And what you and I are trying to do, Dr. Dan, is we're trying to educate people so they find it early. Think of it early in the diagnosis, not waiting like I did. It was 8 years down the road, and some changes had already happened that were so difficult to reverse. So I think it's important that if you're recognizing these symptoms early, if you are, if all the kids in a classroom are sick and the teacher's sick all the time, then suspect that something's going on at the school and air quality at the school. Get together with the PTA and say, demand a high quality air testing. Bring in some surreptitious mold plates from Immunolab, from Immunolytics, so these are some of the ways that we can kind of start turning things around, is recognizing it early and not waiting 5-10 years down the road when it's much harder to turn around your immune system. It still can be done. It still can be done.
Absolutely. There's no doubt the body heals itself. And we can just talk briefly, because I think when you're dealing with these type of illnesses, mold illnesses, you need a coach. You need a practitioner who understands this, right? But let's just talk a little bit about, we've been in this long enough, and we've dealt with so many different mold, clients between even just the two of us, let alone all the people in the summit. And there's some things that transition into what's common with all of us that we know works, like using binders in the gut, et cetera. Kind of talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So, again, a common thing that we all want to do is we want to figure out how do we mobilize these toxins and get them out of us. We start with upregulating our detox mechanisms, like in the liver and the bile, get those flowing, get our lymphatic system flowing. You've got to make sure the gut is working. If you're pooping well, getting all those things. And then you can start using binding agents, and there's all different kinds of binders out there. Dr. Shoemaker started out with cholestyramine. Those of us who have been doing this for a while, we don't use that so much anymore. There's charcoal, clay, there's pectins.
It caused people, especially those suffering from constipation, it was hell.
Right. And so, you can use pectins, and even with children, there's some fruit pectins that you can use, apple, orange, cranberry pectins. You can actually make applesauce and make things. I have a little recipe in our mold detox diet book that comes along with the summit if you get the upgrade to it. So we can use zeolite is another one. So it depends what you're trying to bind.
The cytodetox has particles big that stay in the gut and particles that go to the cell, which are needed too.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
You have to pull these things off the cell membrane. And so Cyto has worked. It's been a godsend for us. We also use Bind that has 4 different types of binders.
Yeah.
It has, a lot of people try to use carbon, but there's only one carbon actually proven to actually pull biotoxin. And it's a special carbon that we import from Holland, by the way. But it is, if this stuff gets on the counter, you can't get it off. That's how strong it is. But anyways, these binders become, and upregulating cell function. If you don't upregulate what the cell naturally needs to do to get rid of the biotoxin from the membranes, you're dead in the water there
Right.
too. So,
Absolutely, and this is where we can use things like, again, B vitamins. If somebody's really super sick and super reactive, they're dumping histamine all the time, so they're sensitive to everything. They can't take any supplements. They can't eat any foods. Then we have whole protocols to help deal with and approach those clients, because that's a problem, multiple chemical sensitivity. So you start by decreasing your total toxic load in your environment. Eating organic, staying away from sugar, staying away from grains. Those are some simple things, and that we discuss in the summit. Something else super simple is you start irrigating your nasal sinuses. Just using sinus rinse. We add different preparations to that, different botanicals to help knock off things. We can also use prescription colloidal silver, EDTA. I don't use the beg spray as much anymore. But you can also use prescription antifungals.
EDTA is the better way to go.
Prescription antifungals. So there's a lot of protocols that are being used. Dr. Joseph Brewer is one of the ones who started using antifungals nasally, and that can be very helpful. Who's been sick for a long time. So, but folks can just use plain old sinus rinse and just start taking a shower inside your nose. Just wash the mold out.
Yeah.
That right there, that's helpful. And like you said, binding agents, and then you want to do anything you can to sweat to try and get it out of your pores. Epsom salt baths. For some folks, things like coffee enemas. We talked to Wendy Myers a lot about detox and, again, different detox mechanisms. So if you have access to an infrared sauna, that's amazing. We have a new company out that's called HotWorks that you can go work out in a sort of infrared sauna kind of environment for really inexpensive for a month. So, where you can go frequently for free. So that's something to think about. If you've been really sick, if you have lots of family members that are sick, then purchasing a really high quality, portable, smaller infrared unit may be useful to get everybody on board. And then, give everybody some binding agents. Again, I use a combo binding agent as well. But I'm very interested in yours.
Yeah, no, I mean, it works well. It's been changed and bettered over the years, that's for sure. Well, look, number one, folks, I mean, if you have these symptoms that we discussed, you might want to consider looking further into your home and into your own immune system, what's going on in your own body, the urine test. But if you think this could be you, so, that's why we're training doctors as well. So, Dr. Margaret, it's great just to be able to bring this information. And I know people are going to get the summit. We'll make sure we put that link here because it's a wealth of knowledge that you brought in. This topic, I'm telling you, it's the three things: metals, mold, and hidden infections are why people still aren't feeling well, and have unexplainable illnesses that doctors are just covering up with medication and functional medicine.
I agree. Yeah, we didn't get enough training in this particular area, and so that's part of why I'm doing this, is to raise awareness, because it's such a huge, challenging problem. The other thing I just wanted to mention is on the 5th day of the summit, that's when I have the different mold inspectors and all that. But I talked to George Swanson, who's a building biologist, which is just amazing. There's only 600 certified building biologists in this country. In Germany, there's like 85,000 of them. You have to have that certification in order to build houses. He talks about using materials like magnesium oxide and like rock wool insulation. And there's different, and how do you build a house so that it breathes? How do you build a house also so that it guides EMFs out of it, and a building to guide EMFs out? What are some of the things that we can do for that? And EMFs is a whole nother area, but you know what? If you're sick, turn off your damn Wi-Fi at night for sure. And don't have any electronics in your bedroom. That's one of the things that you can be helpful. Get a real high quality air filter. I have some suggestions again in the ebook that you can put in your bedrooms. That's something else simple that you can do. Drink filtered water. If nothing else, get a pitcher for your refrigerator. So those are some simple things that you could do. Rinse out your sinuses. Sweat a little bit, and start eating apple and orange and cranberry pectins, and okra has lots of pectins as binding agents. So if you don't know anything else to do, you can do those things.
Yeah, that's great advice and something people can do right away. So thank you, Dr. Margaret. Just great. And what a great summit. And I can't wait to hear George. I want to hear his talk just for the EMF reasons alone. But you're right. They're building homes much different than we are
Mhm.
in other parts of the country than we here are in the US. It's amazing we're still using drywall with
Mhm.
paper. It really
Yeah,
is. Perfect food. Just add water and you
right.
have home.
That's true.
All right.
That's
Thank
great.
you for being on Cell TV. Thank
You
you.
are welcome. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thanks to one of our sponsors, CytoDefend. Look, at a time like this, I think that our immune system and keeping our immune system up right now is more important than ever. I can also tell you that I pay attention to the things that keep my immune system on par and healthy. So glad that CytoDefend is one of our sponsors here on Cell TV. And it's a product that I use, my family uses, and hopefully you'll check it out. And by the way, you can check it out with the link right here below. If you want to try a free bottle, you can actually get a free bottle, just pay the shipping. And I think you'll reorder after that, but check it out.
If you're listening to this podcast and want to access the amazing CytoDefend product Dr. Pompa just mentioned, please visit freeimmunity.com. Again, that's freeimmunity.com. Well, that's it for this week. The materials and content within this podcast are intended as general information only and are not to be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you would like to purchase some of the supplements mentioned on this show, please visit the site as seen on CHTV.com and use the code CHTV15 for 15% off. Again, that's as seen on CHTV.com. Use the code CHTV15 for 15% off. And as always, thanks for listening.